When I reflect on my childhood, some memories stand out more than others, not because they were enjoyable at the time, but because they fundamentally altered my life's path in unforeseen ways. I was 12 when it all began, residing in a tranquil suburban area where every home resembled the next, yet each individual harbored their own tales, secrets, and wounds. Then there was Margaret. Margaret was the kind of neighbour everyone steered clear of. At 65, she was first truly noticed by me, and she had already established a reputation across the street. People referred to her as the neighbourhood witch, although no one would dare say that to her face. She was the woman who scolded children for playing near her yard, reprimanded dog owners if their pets ventured too close to the bushes, and always seemed to identify flaws with each neighbour. Her house looked as tired as she did. Peeling paint, a collapsed balcony, windows that had not seen fresh curtains in years. Even as a child, I remember thinking how lonely she looked, but I never dared to come close. No one. She carried an invisible wall around her, and most of us were relieved that we didn't have to cross. More before I tell you this wonderful story, subscribe to the channel and comment if you would do the same what I did with that lady.
Winter morning, everything changed. It had snowed all night, leaving a thick blanket across the street, muffling the world in silence. I was walking back from school, my backpack heavier than usual, when I saw her. Margaret was outside her house, bundled in a faded gray coat, holding an old shovel that looked almost too heavy for her to manage. She pushed it into the snow with visible effort, her breath clouding in the icy air. Every movement looked painful, like the snow was fighting back against her frail body. Most kids my age would have crossed the street, ignored her, or maybe even laughed at the sight. She had never given anyone a reason to feel sympathy for her. But something inside me stopped me in my tracks. Maybe it was the way her shoulders slumped, or the way the shovel slipped from her gloved hands as if her strength had betrayed her. For a moment I hesitated. She wasn't exactly approachable, but I couldn't just walk away. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice trembling in the frozen air. Margaret snapped her head up, her eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. "No," she barked, her voice sharp and brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Go home. This isn't your concern. I should have left. Any other day, I would have obeyed and carried on with my walk." But something about the sight of her struggling stirred a stubbornness in me. Maybe it was childish defiance, or maybe it was compassion, though I didn't yet understand what that word truly meant. "I don't mind," I said. "I'm strong enough. I can help." Her frown deepened, and for a moment I thought she would scream at me like she did with the other kids. But instead she sighed, a long, tired sigh that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. She tightened her grip on the shovel, then suddenly let it drop into the snow. "Fine," she muttered, turning her back to me. "Do as you wish." I picked up the shovel, my small hands gripping the cold handle, and started clearing the snow. It was heavier than I expected, but there was a strange satisfaction in moving it aside, creating a path on her porch. Margaret stood silently behind me, her arms crossed, watching every move like a hawk. At first, I thought she was judging me, waiting for me to fail. But as I shoveled, I caught a glimpse of something unusual, her eyes softening, just a little, as if she hadn't expected me to persist. We didn't speak much that day. When I finished, panting and red-cheeked, I handed the shovel back to her. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. But as I turned to leave, I heard her voice, quieter this time. "Good job, kid." It was nothing more than a whisper, but it was the first time anyone in the neighborhood had heard Margaret say something remotely kind. And it was the first time I felt a strange pull toward her, like I had cracked a small part of the wall she had built around herself. The next day, I walked past her house again, half expecting to see her outside. She wasn't. But the following week, something happened that drew me back into her orbit. I was carrying a bag of groceries home for my mother when I heard her voice calling out from her porch. "You there, girl?" I froze, unsure if she meant me. "Yes," I replied cautiously. She squinted at me, her frail frame leaning on the porch rail. "You go to the store, don't you?" "Yes," I said slowly. "Then next time, buy me some aspirin," she demanded. "Here." She reached into her pocket and tossed a crumpled $5 bill toward me. It landed in the snow at my feet. I should have been offended at her tone. She didn't ask nicely, didn't even try to sound polite. But something about her vulnerability, the way her hands trembled as she extended the money, made me nod without protest. That was how it began. First, aspirin, then milk, then bread, then little by little, she began to depend on me for errands she could no longer manage alone. At first, I told myself it was just a task, something small I could do. But soon, it became more than that. Each trip to the store, each delivery to her doorstep, turned into a few minutes of conversation. She still snapped at me sometimes, still acted like the world owed her something. But beneath that harsh exterior, I began to see glimpses of someone else, someone lonely, someone afraid, someone desperate to be remembered. One afternoon, when I brought her groceries, she invited me in. Her house smelled of dust and old wood, with stacks of newspapers piled high and furniture covered in fading fabrics. But what struck me most were the photographs. Dozens of them, scattered on shelves and hanging crookedly on the walls. Pictures of a family I had never seen. A man with kind eyes, 2 children smiling brightly, and Margaret herself, much younger, her face radiant with joy. "Your family?" I asked softly. Her eyes flickered to the pictures, and for a brief second, her stern expression faltered. "They left," she said coldly, her voice sharp again. "Husband, children, all of them, left me here to rot." I didn't know what to say. I was 12. I couldn't understand the depth of abandonment she claimed. But I remember the weight in her tone, the bitterness in her words. And yet, as she spoke, her fingers lingered on one of the frames, tracing the smile of a boy who looked no older than I was. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Everyone else saw a bitter, angry old woman. But I had glimpsed something more. A crack in the armor, a wound that had never healed. And somehow, I knew I was meant to keep returning. That winter marked the beginning of a story I would carry with me forever. A story of 2 lives that collided by chance, but changed by choice. Because what started as an act of pity became something much deeper. And what began with a simple shovel in the snow would soon unravel into secrets, truths, and revelations I could never have imagined. Margaret's house had always been the one that children were told to avoid. It sat on the corner of Maplewood Lane, with its peeling paint, rusting gate, and an aura that seemed to push people away. But for me, Anna became a second home. After the day I helped her with groceries, something in Margaret shifted, just slightly, like a door left ajar. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain at 12 years old, I stepped through that door. At first, my visits were simple and short. I would bring her small bags from the market, or help sweep the porch when dry leaves piled up. Margaret never said thank you in the way most adults did. Instead, she would mutter under her breath, sometimes criticizing how I carried the bags or how I held the broom. But beneath the gruffness, I could sense something else, an unspoken appreciation. My parents didn't quite understand why I spent time at her house. "Anna, she's not the easiest woman to deal with," my mother warned. "She's lived a hard life, and people say she pushes everyone away." But I shrugged. Something about Margaret drew me in. Maybe it was the loneliness in her eyes, or the way her voice cracked when she mentioned her children. One rainy afternoon, I sat with her in the dimly lit living room while thunder rumbled outside. Margaret sat in her old armchair, wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. She stared at a photograph on the wall, 3 young children, a younger version of herself, and a man with stern eyes. "They left me," she said suddenly, her voice sharp but trembling. "My husband, my children. They walked away and never looked back. Do you know what it feels like to be forgotten, Anna?" I didn't know what to say. At 12, my world still revolved around school, friends, and my parents' affection. The thought of being abandoned was foreign, but I could hear the pain in her words, and instinctively, I reached out and held her hand. She flinched at first, then let it rest in mine. It was cold, frail, but strong in its own way. From that moment on, I became more than a helper, I became her listener. Day after day, she would tell me fragments of her past. Some stories were bitter, others filled with longing. She spoke of arguments with neighbors, of broken promises, of betrayal. But most of all, she spoke of waiting for her family to return. Weeks turned into months. I would stop by her house after school, sometimes staying until dusk. I helped dust the shelves, water the plants, and organize the cluttered kitchen. She taught me how to cook simple meals, though she barked at me when I chopped the vegetables unevenly. Still, I love those moments. One day, as we folded laundry together, Margaret looked at me with unusual seriousness. "You're different, Anna," she said. "The other children run when they see me. The neighbors whisper behind my back. But you stayed. Why?" I thought about it for a moment, then said, "Because you need someone. And maybe I do too." She didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of warmth hidden beneath years of bitterness. But not everything was peaceful. The closer I grew to Margaret, the more tension arose in my own home. My parents worried I was spending too much time there. "You're only a child," my father said one evening at dinner. "It's not your job to take care of a grown woman. But she has no one else." I argued, "If I don't help her, who will?" My parents exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't stop me, but their concern lingered like a shadow. One afternoon, as I carried groceries into Margaret's kitchen, I noticed something strange. She had left a drawer slightly open, revealing old letters stacked neatly inside. Curiosity tugged at me, but before I could peek further, she snapped, "Don't touch that." Her tone was sharp, almost panicked. I stepped back quickly, apologizing. But the incident left me unsettled. What secrets was Margaret hiding? The answer came a few weeks later. We were drinking tea by the window when Margaret suddenly grew quiet. She stared outside, her eyes clouded with memories. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "They're not really gone, you know. My family. They're out there somewhere. They'll come back for me." Her words puzzled me. "But you said they abandoned you." "They did," she said, her voice breaking. "But one day they'll remember. They'll walk through that door, and I'll forgive them. I always forgive." At that moment, I realized the depth of her denial. Margaret truly believed her family was still alive, still capable of returning. But something in her tone, something in the sadness of her eyes, told me there was more to the story. The first real reviravolta came unexpectedly. One evening, while dusting the shelves, I accidentally knocked over a small wooden box. Paper spilled across the floor, along with faded photographs. My heart raced as I picked them up. Pictures of her husband, her children, but also documents I didn't understand. Death certificates. One for her husband, one for her eldest son, and another for her youngest daughter. My breath caught. I looked up at Margaret, who stood frozen, her face pale. For a moment, I thought she would scream at me, but instead, tears filled her eyes. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered. I stammered, "But you said they abandoned you. You said they left." She collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. I can't accept it, Anna. If I believe they're gone, then I'm truly alone. And I can't be alone. Her confession broke me. I wanted to comfort her, but I also felt the weight of her secret. The bitterness, the anger, the years of pushing people away, it all came from the same place, grief too heavy to carry. From then on, I saw Margaret differently. She wasn't just the cranky old neighbor. She was a woman drowning in sorrow, clinging to denial as her only lifeline. And somehow I became her anchor. But the story didn't end there. Another twist awaited, one that would test the fragile bond we had built. One Saturday, while helping her clean the attic, I discovered an old trunk. Inside were journals, pages filled with her handwriting. At first, I skimmed through, curious about her past. But what I found shocked me. Entries describing arguments with her husband, accusations of betrayal, even suspicions of secrets he kept from her. One passage read, "I wonder if he truly loved me, or if I was just another chapter in his life. He speaks in whispers on the phone at night. The children ask questions I cannot answer. I feel like a stranger in my own home." The words painted a picture far more complicated than the one Margaret had shared. It wasn't just abandonment or loss. There were layers of conflict, mistrust, and pain. When I confronted her gently about it, Margaret grew furious. "You had no right to read that," she shouted. But behind the anger, I saw fear. Fear of her memories. Fear of the truth she couldn't bear to face. That night, I went home shaken. I lay in bed, wondering if I had done the right thing by staying in her life. But then I remembered her trembling hand in mine, her voice breaking as she spoke of loneliness. Whatever her flaws, Margaret needed me. And in some strange way, I needed her too. By the time I was 13, our bond had deepened beyond explanation. Margaret was still harsh at times, still guarded, but she had let me into her world. I was no longer just a neighbor. I was her companion, her listener, her substitute family. And though I didn't know it then, the choices I made during those years would shape the rest of my life. Because Margaret's story was far from over, and neither was mine. I was 14 when Margaret's health began to falter. It started with small things, her shortness of breath while climbing the stairs, her trembling hands when she tried to hold a teacup. At first, she dismissed it. "Just old age, Anna," she said, waving away my concern. But I knew better. Something deeper was happening. Despite her illness, Margaret clung to her routines. Every morning, she would sit by the window, staring at the street as though waiting for someone to arrive. Her faith in her family's return remained unshaken, even after I had uncovered the truth in those dusty death certificates. 4 months, I wrestled with whether to confront her again. Should I push her to accept reality, or should I let her live inside her fragile illusion? I was just a teenager, but I carried the weight of her secret as though it were my own. One evening, as I was helping her prepare dinner, Margaret suddenly stopped chopping vegetables and said, "You remind me of my daughter." I froze. "Your daughter?" "Yes," she said softly, her eyes far away. "She was stubborn like you, always asking questions, always trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Sometimes I hear her voice when you speak." The words pierced me. Part of me wanted to correct her, to remind her that her daughter was gone. But another part of me couldn't bear to shatter her fragile hope. So I smiled and continued cooking, carrying the unspoken truth like a burden in my chest. But fate has a cruel way of forcing truth to the surface. One stormy night, lightning flickered through the windows as I helped Margaret into bed. She was weaker than usual, her breath shallow. "Anna," she whispered, clutching my hand. "Promise me something." "Anything," I said. "When they come back, when my children return, you'll tell them I never stopped waiting. You'll tell them I forgave them." Tears blurred my vision. I wanted to scream that they were never coming, that she was clinging to ghosts. But instead I nodded. "I promise." She smiled faintly, then drifted into sleep. That night, I lay awake in my own bed, torn between compassion and honesty. Was I helping her by preserving her illusion, or was I letting her die with lies? The next reviravolta came not from Margaret, but from the past. One afternoon, while helping her organize old boxes, I stumbled upon a locked chest. Margaret was napping, so I hesitated, but curiosity gnawed at me. With trembling hands, I searched until I found a small brass key tucked in a drawer. When I opened the chest, my breath caught. Inside were stacks of letters, dozens, maybe hundreds, addressed to Margaret. They were from her children. The postmarks spanned years. Each envelope was worn, some torn at the edges, but all carefully preserved. My hands shook as I read the first one. Dear Mother, I'm sorry I haven't visited. Life has been hard, and I know we don't always agree. But I want you to know I love you. Letter after letter revealed the truth. Her children hadn't abandoned her. They had reached out, time and again. Some apologized for arguments. Others begged her to forgive them. But Margaret, whether out of pride, bitterness, or denial, had never answered. The weight of the discovery crushed me. She hadn't been abandoned. She had pushed them away. When I confronted her later, holding one of the letters in my trembling hands, Margaret's reaction shocked me. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. You went through my things. Margaret, they wrote to you, I pleaded. Your children, they tried. They wanted to come back. She snatched the letter from my hands, crumpling it. No, they left me. They chose their lives over me. If they truly cared, they would have stood by my side, not hidden behind paper and ink. But you never wrote back. I cried. You never gave them a chance. Her face twisted with anger, but beneath it, I saw something else, fear. If I admit they cared, then I must also admit I pushed them away. And I cannot live with that, Anna. Her words shattered me. 4 years, I had believed Margaret was a victim of abandonment. But the truth was more complicated. She was both victim and culprit, trapped in a prison of her own making. Despite the tension, I couldn't leave her. If anything, I grew more determined to stay. She was sick, vulnerable, and whether she admitted it or not, she needed me. At 15, while my friends were going to parties and worrying about exams, I was learning how to manage Margaret's medications, cook her meals, and keep her company through long, lonely nights. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret said something that stunned me. You know, Anna, if I had met you earlier in life, maybe I wouldn't have lost them. Her voice was soft, almost tender. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of regret, genuine regret, flicker across her face. Another reviravolta came when a man arrived at Margaret's door. He was in his late 50s, with tired eyes and a kind smile. I'm looking for Margaret Harris, he said. I hesitated, then let him in. Margaret's face turned pale when she saw him. David, she whispered. It was her youngest son. For a moment, I thought this was the miracle she had been waiting for. But the reunion was anything but joyful. You never answered me, David said, his voice heavy. All those letters, all those years, I begged you to let me in. But you shut me out. Margaret's lips trembled. You abandoned me. No, he said firmly. You abandoned us. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat frozen, watching the fragile illusion Margaret had built crumble before my eyes. David left that night, tears in his eyes, and I knew he would never return. Margaret, however, refused to speak of it again. That wasn't real, she insisted the next day. Just a dream. Her denial deepened, and I realized that no matter how much truth confronted her, she would always retreat into her version of reality. By 16, I had grown used to the contradictions. Margaret was both cruel and kind, bitter and vulnerable. Some days, she would lash out at me for the smallest mistake. Other days, she would clutch my hand and whisper, Don't leave me, Anna. Promise me you won't leave. And despite everything, the lies, the secrets, the pain, I couldn't bring myself to break that promise, because in some strange, twisted way, she had become my family. The biggest reviravolta of all came when Margaret fell seriously ill. The doctors said her time was limited, and she needed constant care. By then, I was 17. Most teenagers my age were preparing for college applications or dreaming of their future. But my future was tied to Margaret's fading life. I bathed her, fed her, read to her when her eyes grew too weak. Sometimes she mistook me for her daughter, sometimes for her younger self. But always she needed me. One night, as I sat by her bedside, she whispered, "Anna, you saved me, even when I didn't deserve saving." Tears streamed down my face. "You're not alone, Margaret. I'm here." She smiled faintly, then drifted into sleep. By the time I turned 18, I had lost count of the reviravoltas, the secrets uncovered, the lies revealed, the moments of truth denied. Margaret's life was a tangled web of grief, denial, and longing. And somehow I had become part of it. But little did I know, the greatest twist of all still waited for me in the years ahead. When I turned 19, I felt older than my years. While my friends celebrated graduation parties, traveled on summer trips, or took their first steps into independence, I was tethered to a fragile world inside Margaret's house. Every day was a cycle of medications, meals, and moments of silence punctuated by coughs and whispers. Margaret was 74 now, her body frail, her movements slow. The sharp-tongued woman, who had once terrified the neighborhood, was fading into someone softer, though still stubborn in her own way. Her mind wandered more often, drifting between reality and memory, pulling me along with her into shadows of a past I didn't fully understand. One autumn evening, while I was sorting through her laundry, she called to me from the living room. Her voice was unusually gentle. "Anna, sit with me." I obeyed, setting the folded clothes aside. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, a knitted blanket draped over her knees, her gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the fireplace. For a long time, she said nothing, and I wondered if she had forgotten why she called me. Then, without looking at me, she whispered, "Do you think I was a bad mother?" The question stunned me. Margaret never admitted weakness, never sought validation. I swallowed hard, choosing my words carefully. "I think you were hurt, and sometimes hurt people make mistakes." Her lips trembled. "They hated me, Anna. My children. I wanted to love them, but I didn't know how. I thought discipline was love. I thought keeping them close by force would keep them safe. Instead, they left. And when they wrote, I couldn't bear to face my failures. So I burned some of their letters and locked the others away." My heart tightened. It was the first time she had confessed this aloud. "You're not beyond forgiveness," I said softly. "Maybe not from them, but from yourself." Tears glistened in her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. "Do you think God forgives women like me?" I reached for her hand. "I think God forgives anyone who's brave enough to ask." It was the closest I had ever seen her to peace. But the peace didn't last. A few weeks later, I found Margaret collapsed on the kitchen floor. Panic surged through me as I called an ambulance, my hands trembling as I tried to wake her. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what I had feared. Her heart was failing. She stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks, and during that time, I visited every day. I skipped my classes, ignoring my friends' invitations, dedicating myself completely to her. The nurses began to look at me strangely, as if wondering why a young woman was sacrificing so much for a difficult old lady. One nurse, a kind woman named Clara, pulled me aside one evening. "She's lucky to have you. But Anna, don't forget to live your own life too." I forced a smile but said nothing. How could I explain that Margaret wasn't just a duty to me? She was a bond, a mirror of everything I feared about loneliness, abandonment, and regret. If I left her, it would feel like betraying not just her, but myself. When she finally returned home, Margaret seemed weaker than ever. Yet in her frailty, she also grew more open. She began sharing stories about her childhood, her marriage, even her regrets about choices she had buried for decades. One night, as I was tucking her into bed, she whispered, "Anna, I never told you the truth about my husband." I frowned. "What truth?" Her voice trembled. "He didn't leave me. He died. A car accident. But for years, I told myself he abandoned me. It was easier to be angry than to grieve." I froze, her confession settling over me like a heavy blanket. "And your children?" Her eyes filled with tears. "They loved me, but my bitterness poisoned everything. I pushed them away, and when they tried to return, I shut them out." The truth unraveled before me, darker and sadder than I had imagined. Margaret had lived decades imprisoned by her own denial, rewriting her pain into a story of abandonment because facing loss was too unbearable. "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered. "Because," she said, clutching my hand with surprising strength, "I don't want to leave this world with lies. I want you to know who I really was, even if you hate me for it." "I could never hate you," I said, my voice breaking. "You made mistakes, yes, but you let me in. You gave me a place when I had none." Her grip tightened, "And you gave me a reason to live again." The winter that followed was brutal. Snow piled high on the streets, just like the day I first met Margaret 3 years earlier. Except this time, she couldn't step outside to face it. She watched from her window, bundled in blankets, as I shoveled her walkway, just as I had when I was 12. "Full circle," she murmured one day, watching me from the porch. "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently, Anna? That you hadn't stopped to help me that first day?" I looked up at her, my cheeks red from the cold. "Never. Helping you was the best choice I ever made." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. Then maybe my life wasn't wasted after all. The next Reviravolta came in the form of a visitor I never expected. It was late evening when a knock echoed through the house. Margaret was dozing in her chair, so I went to the door. Standing there was a woman in her 40s, her face eerily familiar. "I'm looking for Margaret Harris," she said softly. "I'm her daughter, Claire." My heart raced. Claire, one of the children Margaret insisted had abandoned her. When she entered, Margaret stirred awake. The moment her eyes landed on Claire, her expression shifted from disbelief to fear. You're not real," Margaret whispered. "I'm real, Mother," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I came because I heard you were sick. I couldn't stay away any longer." The room fell into silence, broken only by the ticking clock. I watched as decades of pain, pride, and distance hovered between them. Finally, Claire stepped closer, kneeling by her mother's chair. "I forgive you," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "All I ever wanted was to come home." For the first time in years, Margaret's facade crumbled. She sobbed openly, clutching her daughter's hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry." The reunion was raw, imperfect, but real. And for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to feel both grief and love at once. That night, as I lay in my bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed. I had seen hatred turned into forgiveness, denial into acceptance. Margaret's story wasn't ending with bitterness, it was bending toward healing. And though she still carried the scars of her past, she was no longer alone in them. By spring, Margaret was weaker than ever, her body giving way to the inevitable. But her spirit seemed lighter. She smiled more, even laughed occasionally. Claire visited often, sometimes bringing flowers or books to read aloud. One afternoon, Margaret took my hand and whispered, "Anna, you gave me back my family. Without you, I would have died bitter and blind. You gave me a second chance." I squeezed her hand. You gave me one too. You taught me what love really means, even when it's hard. She smiled faintly. Then we saved each other. As her 75th birthday approached, I could feel the end drawing near. She grew weaker by the day, sleeping more, eating less. But she insisted on celebrating, even in her fragile state. We baked a small cake together. Well, I baked, and she directed from her chair. When I placed a single candle on top and lit it, she whispered, "This is the happiest birthday I've had in years." I leaned down, hugging her gently. "Happy birthday, Margaret." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "Thank you, Anna, for everything." But the Reviravolta that would change my life forever was still waiting. Because Margaret had one final gift, one final truth, that she had been saving just for me. And I would only discover it after she was gone. I don't think I will ever forget the day everything changed. By then, Margaret was 75 years old, and I had just turned 20. Over the years, we had walked such a strange and beautiful road together, from enemies across the fence to something that looked more like family. And now, the woman who once seemed invincible, with her sharp tongue and iron will, was suddenly fragile, her health crumbling like an old wall that could no longer stand. It began with her forgetting small things. At first, I thought it was simply age. She would ask me if I had already gone to the store, though I had just come back with her groceries. She would misplace her glasses, or complain that someone had moved them, even though they were resting on her head. Slowly, her sharp wit dulled, and there were moments when she looked at me as though she wasn't quite sure who I was. Those moments frightened me, but I refused to let them steal the woman I knew. Then came the sickness. Her breathing grew shallow, her steps weaker. I urged her to see doctors, and though she resisted, muttering about how hospitals were just places where old people went to die, eventually she gave in. The tests revealed what I had feared. Her heart was failing. When the doctor said the words, I felt as if someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my lungs. Margaret, on the other hand, sat calmly, her eyes distant, as though she had expected this all along. "Well," she said finally, in that same sarcastic tone I had heard 1,000 times, "it's not like I was planning to live forever." But I could see in her eyes that she was afraid. From that day on, my life revolved around her. I went to school in the mornings, and then rushed to her house in the afternoons. I cooked, cleaned, and sat with her through long nights when she couldn't sleep. I read to her from the books she loved, the spy thrillers that reminded her of her late husband, and the poetry she always pretended she didn't care for but secretly adored. Sometimes, she would drift into her memories and speak of her husband and children as though they were still alive. "They'll be home soon," she whispered one evening, her frail hand clutching mine. "I need to be strong for them." I didn't know how to respond. My heart ached with the truth I carried, that her family had been gone for years. But how could I destroy her hope, fragile and beautiful as it was? So I nodded, swallowed my tears, and said, "Yes, Margaret, they'll be proud of you." Her eyes softened, and she squeezed my hand. In that moment, I realized that sometimes love means holding someone's illusions, not shattering them. It was late one autumn evening when Margaret opened up in a way she never had before. The house smelled of soup, and the rain tapped against the windows. She sat wrapped in a heavy blanket, her voice low and trembling. "I used to think," she began, "that bitterness kept me alive, that pushing people away made me stronger. I told myself my family had abandoned me because it was easier than admitting they were gone. Abandonment leaves you angry. Death leaves you empty." Her words pierced me. For the first time, she spoke plainly about the truth she had buried under decades of anger. Tears welled in her eyes, something I had rarely seen. "But you," she whispered, looking at me, "you refused to leave me alone. You brought warmth into a house that had grown so cold. Anna, you became the daughter I lost, the daughter I never thought I'd have again." My throat closed, and all I could do was hug her. We cried together. Two souls bound not by blood but by love, forged through stubbornness, pain, and persistence. Winter came hard that year. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind howled outside like a chorus of ghosts. Margaret's body grew weaker each day. She no longer walked much. Instead, she stayed in bed, her breath shallow, her once commanding voice now a whisper. One night, as I read aloud to her, she reached out and stopped me. Her hand was cold, but her grip was firm. "Anna," she said, "promise me something. Promise me you'll live your life boldly. Don't waste it waiting for people to come back. Don't waste it on bitterness. Love recklessly. Forgive freely. And go to college. Use that big brain of yours to do something remarkable." I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I promise, Margaret. I promise." She smiled then, a small, peaceful smile. "Good girl," she whispered. "That's my Anna." Margaret passed away, quietly 2 weeks later. I was sitting by her side, holding her hand, when she exhaled for the last time. There were no dramatic words, no final speeches, just silence, heavy and complete. The grief that followed was overwhelming. I felt as though part of me had been ripped away. The house was too quiet without her grumbling about the neighbors, too empty without her voice filling the rooms. A few days after the funeral, I was summoned to meet with her lawyer. I expected nothing, maybe a small keepsake, a book, or a piece of jewelry. But as I sat across from the lawyer, he slid a folder toward me, his expression serious. "Margaret left everything to you," he said. I blinked, confused. "Everything?" He nodded. "The house, her savings, and a fund specifically designated for your college education." Shock washed over me like a tidal wave. I had never imagined she would do something like this. The house that had once been the fortress of a bitter old woman was now mine. The savings she had guarded so fiercely were placed in my hands. Inside the folder was also a letter, written in her shaky handwriting. "My dearest Anna, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know you will cry, but I hope you will also smile, because you made the last years of my life worth living. You gave me laughter when I thought I would never laugh again. You gave me love when I believed I had been abandoned. I want you to know that you were my miracle. Use this gift to build a life full of love and meaning. Carry me with you, but never let grief chain you down. I will always be with you, in every step, in every triumph, in every quiet moment when you wonder if you're strong enough. You are. You always have been. Love, Margaret." I pressed the letter to my heart and sobbed. For years, Margaret had believed she was abandoned. That lie had been her shield against despair. But in the end, the truth came out. She wasn't abandoned. She was loved, not by the family she lost, but by me. And in return, she gave me more than I ever could have asked for. The greatest reviravolta was not the inheritance, not the house or the money. It was the transformation of a lonely, bitter woman into someone capable of love again, and the transformation of a young girl into a woman who understood the depth of compassion, resilience, and the power of human connection. Years later, I would often sit on Margaret's porch, watching the neighborhood children play in the yard. Sometimes, I imagined Margaret sitting beside me, muttering complaints about the noise, even though she secretly loved it. I went to college, just as she wanted. I built a career, built a life. But no matter where I went, Margaret was with me. She had shaped me in ways I could never fully explain. And whenever I felt lost or afraid, I remembered her words. Love recklessly. Forgive freely. Live boldly. That was Margaret's true inheritance. And it was worth more than any house or bank account. Presence never truly left my life. She taught me that family isn't always defined by blood, but by love, loyalty, and the courage to stay when others walk away. Her greatest gift was not just the house or the inheritance. It was the reminder that even the hardest hearts can learn to love again, and that kindness has the power to rewrite someone's destiny. And now I ask you, have you ever met someone who completely changed your life just by being there at the right time? Thought Balloon. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and tell me about that person who made a difference in your life. And of course, Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story full of emotion, surprises, and life-changing lessons. Because sometimes the people we least expect become the greatest blessing in our lives.